There's nothing quite like coming to church on a rainy Sunday morning, singing along to the organ and hearing the story of a beheading. The story seems to come out of nowhere with its gruesome, grisly details of the beheading of Jesus' family member and friend, confidant, and baptizer, John. This is the same John that we heard so much about in Advent several months back, first hearing of him as he leapt with joy in the womb of his mother Elizabeth, as she greeted Mary, who had just conceived Jesus in her own womb. This is the same John that we heard accounts of years later as he wandered through the wilderness, preparing the way of the Lord, eating bugs and wild honey, and wearing shirts made out of hair. This is the same John who dunked Jesus in the River Jordan as the heavens tore open above them and Jesus was named as beloved. That John, that's who we meet today in the Gospel of Mark as he comes to the end of his earthly journey, beheaded to fulfill the seemingly senseless wishes of a young girl, of her conflicted father, and her mysterious mother. The story, it's funny, at each service today has felt so awkward and out of place in the context of our worship and our time. But I think that this story perhaps has never fit anywhere that it's been, no matter what time it was. As the preacher David Luce reflected a few years ago, he said there are a few things about this story that make it stand out the way it does. Not just the grisly details of it, but also the fact that it's one of the longest narrative accounts in all of Mark. And if you noticed, Jesus does not appear in it. The story seems to interrupt the flow of what comes before and after it. And it's told in flashback, recounting something that happened in the past, a technique that Mark does not use anywhere else in the entire gospel. And so for all of these reasons, it seems to stick out, to be out of place, maybe even misplaced, as a story searching for a narrative home. The Gospel of Matthew does include the same story, but with far fewer details. And Luke and John leave it out entirely, which leads us naturally to question why Mark included it, and in such detail, and where he did. David Luce, the preacher I mentioned a few moments ago, reflected on this question of why it's placed where it is, and he posits that the reason it is as it is because it serves as a study in contrast for us, a study in contrast between the kingdoms available to the followers of Jesus, both then and ever since. This sharp contrast piques our interest and invites us in, inviting us to reflect on our own choices when faced with the contrast. So if we look a little closer into Mark and into the flow of that gospel, you'll see that the story that comes just before is the story that we heard in church last week of Jesus commissioning his disciples and sending them out to begin the work of the kingdom of heaven. And then immediately following, we get the story of another kind of kingdom entirely, the kingdom of Herod, which exemplifies the worst of what we humans can dream up together when left to our own devices. A kingdom that's characterized by fear and envy, deception, where winners and losers are kept separate and clearly defined, where life is seen as a commodity that can be expended. This in contrast to the kingdom of heaven as displayed just verses before. If you were here last week, you may remember the story of the commissioning where Jesus sent out the disciples, telling them not even to bring a change of clothes with them. He said, don't even wear 2 tunics, but go out dependent entirely on the hospitality and grace of those you meet. And as you go, Jesus said, offer healing and mercy and expect nothing in return, no rewards for your work. And then on the other side of the story of Herod and his choices, we get the feeding of the 5,000. This, a banquet that stands in such sharp contrast to the banquet of death we heard about today. This banquet that comes later does not have the rich and shameless there, but instead has poor and outcast people flocking by the thousands to come to this meal that's not characterized by political power plays or intrigue, but by surprising, even offending generosity. This is the contrast between the kingdoms, as Mark lays it out, the kingdoms of this world and the kingdom of heaven. And here, as we listen to the stories seen in their context, we're prompted to ask ourselves which of the kingdoms we choose. Which kingdom's values do we want to cultivate in our lives and the lives of our community? The kingdom of this world or the kingdom of heaven? And now, of course, the answer to that question is completely obvious. We want the kingdom of heaven. This is exactly what we've been trained to say from our early upbringing in Sunday school. Those are the leaders that we want. Those are the values that we want in our lives. But before we get too comfortable in our justified answers to that question, perhaps we need to linger for a moment longer with the villain of the story, Herod. Because he, too, liked the kingdom of heaven. Mark includes these almost stunning details that Herod knew John was a righteous and holy man. He feared him, was even confused by him, and yet, as Mark said, Herod liked to listen to John. He liked how that sharp edge of truth felt as he heard the stories of the kingdom of heaven. And yet, when the opportunity arose to make the choice between the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of this world, he was too fearful to lose his own reputation in front of his rich guests and leaders. And so he chose the kingdom of this world. It can be easy, especially with the story told in such extremes, to judge Herod for his lack of courage and his lack of faith. And yet, how often are we prone to make the very same moves in our own lives? As the writer Debbie Thomas reflected this week, no, thankfully, we don't go around ordering the killing of people as a commonplace activity. But how often do we care too much what other people think of us? How often do we prioritize our own status, our own popularity and reputation over the truth? Perhaps for you, you are so bent on conflict avoidance that you harm others with your passivity. Or maybe it's as simple as preferring safety and security over transformation. These are the subtle, almost imperceptible ways that we choose the kingdom of this world over the kingdom of heaven. And so perhaps this is why Mark included the story as he does, where he does. This is why perhaps we must hear it every few years in our lectionary, to invite us into that study of contrast and to the choices that we are given daily as followers of Jesus between the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of this world. To see ourselves in those stories and to sympathize even with Herod, who was given that very choice himself. And then from there, to ask ourselves in each day of our living, which kingdom will we choose? Who will we be? Amen.